John Amos Comenius is our first European influencer on early child education. Comenius was Czechoslovakian, and he was originally a minister, but he directed his time to educational reform at a school where he put these ideas into practice. Comenius had three key ideas in his school. The first one is teaching methods need to be in a setting where students feel they can learn easier and not have to worry about being punished all the time. School should be pleasant. This was one of his main key ideas. Also, his second key idea is teachers should engage children with nature and follow their lead, which means we want to allow them to discover things. We want to send them out and watch and let them figure things out on their own sometimes. And the third key idea of Comenius is that children should not be learning in a language that is not their first language. What he was finding is children were being taught in Latin in schools around his area and around his time period, but he found that children learn better in their own language. This seems like common sense to us today, but this is not a common practice back when he was a reformer for the education system. The other thing that Comenius is known for is some specific things that we have in practice today in early childhood education classrooms. The first main thing is that Comenius found that early childhood education was extremely important as the foundation for early learning endeavors. What this means is the learning that's done when we are youngest sets the standard or the foundation for the learning we will have the rest of our lives and us as adults. He also believed that children learn best through their senses and need to be active, and this is part of the reason why he wanted to take the classroom outdoors. But he also felt that children learned through their interests and their firsthand experiences. So when they're out there and they're discovering things and figuring them out on their own, they're making connections. And those connections are what Comenius said allowed them to remember and their learning. So a lot of times at this point in the education, teachers were talking to children more than children were doing things. And Comenius really reformed that. The last kind of final piece of Comenius' education that we still see today is that physical punishment should not be part of any classroom, and that children behave differently in different developmental stages, and we should have in our minds what is developmentally appropriate for them. This took away the need for a lot of punishment, because when we looked at what children were developmentally capable of doing and what they were not capable of doing, sometimes children were being punished for things that were developmentally inappropriate for them, that they couldn't even consider the right and the wrong or make the choices that we found they were being punished for. So Comenius' ideas back from the 15th century are still in many classrooms today, and he is definitely one of our important European influences on early childhood education. Also an important influence is Johan Pestalozzi, which in the 17th century became an important educator. He was Swiss and agreed with some of the foundations of Comenius, and this is how he started his own school. He believed that all children, including our poverty-stricken children, would benefit from education. And so in his school, he studied child development. He believed his teachers should study child development and really get to know those stages and know at what age and stage children should master certain skills. Now, Pestalozzi was a big proponent of staying in a stage until you mastered all the skills and then moving on to the next stage. But what this came about is the view of the whole child, that we need to look at the child's physical development, their emotional development, their social and moral development, and also their intellectual capabilities. And all of these components should make up our instruction each day. He called this the hand, heart, head philosophy. And this is really important because it looks at that whole child and shows their strengths and not just their weaknesses, especially if their weaknesses were a result of poverty and maybe they were behind intellectually or with skills. Just another important notion that Pestalozzi was involved in is something that is similar to Piaget's theory of constructivism. This is, really that he really believed that by building on what a child knows or the stage that a child has already moved through, we can set them up for success. And this is really vital to learning, and we still see this established in classrooms today. Now, Frdric Bell is a German educator, and he is also an important European influence on early childhood education today because he is known as the father of kindergarten. And this was what he called a garden for children. And he really was looking at this garden philosophy as a natural place where children could go and learn when they were not old enough to be school-age children. He saw goodness in children, and he believed that education should be active and should really revolve around what the children are interested in. He also was a proponent that teachers needed to understand development. So this is a lot like the research of Pestalozzi, that we really need to know what is appropriate for children and how to best teach them at each stage. He saw those stages of development, and they're very similar to those that Piaget formulated in the 20th century. But Frdric Bell was a pioneer in the 17th and 18th centuries. One of the neat things he did that is similar to something we grew up with, but he wrote mother play and nursery songs to assist mothers when they're working with young children. And this is something like our nursery rhymes that we sing with children today. And also, Frdric Bell, and probably most famous for, is he developed kindergarten materials so that when children did get that chance to play and grow as young learners, they had specific materials designed for them. So, we talk about how play should be natural and we should have singing and movement and free play. He also felt free play was important, but he wanted his free play designed basically setting up play so children get a specific learning experience out of it. And so this was a big contribution he had on education. We see this today a lot, especially if you look at some of the materials that he designed for children's free play. They're extremely simple, but educational in nature. Things like shape blocks and a lot of the materials that we would see for lacing and weaving and building. They were natural materials, but they were used specifically for purposes where children could learn. And this is really where we get that influence that is so important for giving children the ability to learn and play at the same time. Frdric Bell's work really kind of spilled into the work of probably one of the most famous European educators, and that's Maria Montessori. And I'm sure many of you have heard of the Montessori schools. They're so popular. They're all over our state and our country. And she was the first major figure in early childhood education that was a physician, and she was even nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. But her work again focused on children that lived in poverty. At this time, we found that children who lived in poverty were kind of written off. It was assumed that they weren't able to learn, and she began her research working with children that society believed were mentally retarded. And she really said, no, all children can learn no matter what, and she found that most of the children identified did not have mental disabilities. They just lived in poverty and didn't have the same experiences as their peers around them. And she designed a program called Casa dei Bambini for young children ages 4 through 7 that was a highly successful approach that stimulated children to learn in a natural environment. So there's some key elements of the Montessori method that she designed. First one is the image that children have an absorbent mind, and this means that they actively learn through their senses. She believed that 4 to 7-year-olds were motivated not through stickers and the kind of rewards we give kiddos today, but they were motivated to interact with their world around them, and they didn't need any of those extrinsic motivators. She's found that that just plain old play, free play, just kids going out and having fun was a waste of their time. She also didn't really think that children learned best from social interactions. And so she really is a proponent of specific activities with an educational purpose and independent learning. Now, if you're going to be learning in the Montessori method, you are in a learning environment that is very specific and very prepared. And this is where the poor children needed to be in a different environment to learn, she felt. Everything in her classroom was designed to be child-sized and child-friendly, and organization is key that children can access what they need on their own because independence is so important in the philosophy of the Montessori method. Basically, she gave children the opportunities to play things like puzzles and knobs. They did things for fine motor control and gross motor control. She designed and invented most of the materials that were used in her school. And she told boys and girls that there were only one way to use her materials. So this is really different than the philosophy that is open-ended, that children can be creative and find ways to use materials on their own that are using their imaginations. Maria Montessori felt like children needed to be given specific directions and specific materials, and only through that interaction would they learn what she wanted them to learn. Also in the Montessori method, we see that children learn life skills at a very young age, and they learn to do these independently. So things like cleaning and preparing for a meal, sweeping the floors, even tasks such as zipping and tying and buttoning, they were learned at a very young age. And a lot of her materials, again, integrated sensory learning. So she used sandpaper and very tactile materials when they were, playing and learning. The other thing we know about Montessori's view is that the teacher's role was to not teach so much, but prepare the environment, observe the children, and, if necessary, demonstrate exactly what the children should be doing with those materials. Other than that, teachers were not supposed to interfere. That independent learning time and that time to figure out the learning process was up to the child. Although, when a teacher does interact, we find that they're having very specific conversations about the experiences that the child had to build upon their learning. We see Montessori schools in place in the year 2016, and a lot of times they are private schools, but in the very recent years, I know even locally, we have Montessori schools that have become charter schools or magnet schools. And what this allows is it allows children to attend a Montessori school, and it does not cost the family anything. So the charter schools are open and the children get to go there for free, and the public schools are funding, the public school that is geographically located in that school district is funding the child to go to that school. So again, she's a very important contributor. There's a lot of research that shows success in the Montessori method. There's also some research that pushes back against it, but it's definitely a huge influence on our early childhood education programs today in the United States.